Welcome everybody to CWCF's annual conference. So I'm Reba Plummer, I'm the president of the Federation, and I'm so happy to see you all here. The Canadian Worker Co-op Federation gratefully and respectfully acknowledges the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of Indigenous peoples, whose presence reaches back to time immemorial and on whose territories we live and work. We also recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. To this end, CWCF has recently approved an action plan to build justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the worker co-op movement. The action plan will be presented in the session happening tomorrow at noon Eastern, building on anti-racism in worker co-ops, practical tools to build real diversity, inclusion, and racial justice, and the need for a culture shift. So I hope you all can join us then. Now, just for a little housekeeping before we get right into the conference. So this session is being recorded so that those that are not able to join the session might view this later. By attending, you have given your permission to be recorded. Please mute yourself except when speaking. If you're participating on the phone, please *6 to mute and unmute yourself. And if you accidentally get unmuted or forget to mute yourself, the technical team are going to do it for you. For networking purposes, we ask that you please change your name by hovering over the menu beside your name, 3 dots, and note the following: your name, your co-op or organization, and your preferred pronouns. Also, please use the raised hand or chat box to indicate that you have a question or want to add to the discussion, so that the facilitator knows. Also, note that there is simultaneous interpretation, French and English, for this session provided by Co-op Largo. Thank you. And you will need to select the language from the Zoom menu bar in order to ensure you always hear the presentation in your preferred language. Even if the presentation is in English and you want to listen in English, you must select a language. I would like to thank the sponsors whose contributions have made this event possible: the cooperators, Just Us Coffee Roasters, Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, and the Ontario Cooperative Association. I also want to thank the volunteers and workers, the speakers, presenters, facilitators who have volunteered their time to help make this event a success. And last but not least, I want to thank CWCF staff and board for all the hard work organizing this event. And no, a virtual conference is not easier than an in-person event, as we have found out. So now let's get started. Our first session is a panel discussion on the global view of what the effect of COVID has been on the worker co-op sector. What's the big picture? What strategies have worker co-ops used to survive and thrive in the face of the pandemic? How can worker co-ops show the way? And worker co-op models to building better together, challenges and opportunities. We are happy to have Victor Beausoleil, the founder and executive director of Social Economy through Social Inclusion, CETSI, and president of the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, CEDNET, as a facilitator for this session. Victor is dedicated to advancing equity and equality throughout our communities. Recently, Victor co-authored an opinion piece for the CBC stating that as we look for solutions to our most pressing existential crises, such as climate change and global pandemics, and the social, environmental, and economic havoc they wreak, social innovation and social finance should be in our toolkit. An investment in social innovation and social finance is an investment in the future of all Canadians. And really, it's an investment in everybody on this planet. So thank you, and take it away, Victor.
Thank you so much, Reba. I appreciate you. As mentioned, my name is Victor Beausoleil. I'm a husband, father of 4, and I give thanks to my ancestors and all the community stalwarts that I stand on their shoulders to be able to be here today to share, learn, and grow with you all. And Reba did a great job in terms of providing the overall context of the discussion. And I want to jump right in. primarily because we have limited time and we have such a phenomenal group of speakers and panelists. So I'm going to hand it off to Francesca, who's been doing some remarkable work, and I'm excited to hear your perspectives, opinions, and beliefs.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this event, to this conference. It's a first. I am a membership coordinator of CICOPA. CICOPA is a sectoral organization of the International Co-operative Alliance for the sector of industry and services. So our members are federations and supportive organizations for cooperatives in this sector, and CWCF, it's one of our members. I'm working in CICOP for 6 years, so finally I can join one of your conferences. It's actually one of the positive side of the digital age, if we can call it like this. So I will go also jump straight to the point because I think I have a lot of things to say. Just for you to know, we represent 3 typology of cooperatives: worker cooperatives, social cooperatives, and what we call independent workers cooperatives. Keep it in mind, and then if you have any question, we can go for later on this. What I want to give you today is a global picture of how we could assess until now the effect that the pandemic had on the cooperatives in the services and industry sector. We don't have data, but we have listened to our members. We have exchanged in several occasions, and so what I'm giving to you today is a bit more of a, let's say, qualitative picture of the feedback that we could have from our members. One thing that we can say is that the pandemic has affected our sector very differently, every activity in the sector in a different way. We can see that some sectors have been affected in sense that they have been much more involved into the crisis. They have increased their activities during the crisis. I'm referring to, for example, the health sector, the care sector, many social cooperatives in hospitals, elderly residences, mental health center, or domestic care services have increased exponentially their work. Workers in this cooperative have put their life at risk. And nowadays still these cooperatives are waiting for governments to receive payment for the work they have done during the emergency times. There are also other cooperatives in other sectors that have flourished during the pandemic. It's maybe the case of the cleaning sector, the home delivery sector, the IT, the retail. On the contrary, some cooperatives had to stop their activity, and they are still facing the consequences of this. And we're talking about maybe the cultural sector, the education sector, and the cooperative in transport. We also see that a lot of our cooperatives have adapted to the situation quickly and changed their production. For example, in the textile sector, cooperatives started producing personal equipment for sanitary reasons. And which also brought to a very interesting international collaboration from cooperatives saying we have masks, we produce masks, and make them available for cooperatives somewhere else in the world. so a lot of solidarity going on, of course. We have also members saying that this crisis has brought new opportunities for their worker and social cooperatives. In many regions, there has been an increasing attention to local and responsible consumption, opening so to new market opportunities for many of these cooperatives. What have been the challenges? Most of our cooperatives have faced important financial problems, mainly when it comes to cash flow. On the same line, some cooperative mutualistic funds in some countries shifted their intervention to respond to this need that they usually provide starting capital for new cooperatives, and they had to shift into emergency intervention. How? Like, for example, guaranteeing cash flow that wasn't available, or also providing risky loans for cooperatives that normal banks were not providing. Something that this is something that apparently they expect to do also for the coming years. Also, we have our colleagues in CICOPA Americas, the regional organization of CICOPA in the Americas, had done a research last year, which brought some interesting results. It seems that, for example, a majority of countries in the CICOPA Americas report that worker cooperatives suffered during the crisis because many national measures for enterprises were not available for worker cooperatives. At the same time, on a positive note, there have been new spaces for intercooperation that have been created by cooperatives themselves in different sectors also. We could witness strong solidarity between sectors, creating new market opportunities, joint purchasing, and so helping each other. We also see that, 2 minutes, wow. Cooperation has been a very important thing, and what we can say is that based on how the COVID has affected also increased the effects, exacerbated also the effect that existed already in the world, in the market. We are talking about maybe inequality, poverty, but also as pushed some other market, like the digital market, and so the digital translation in the transition. In such a context, more collaboration and cooperation amongst cooperatives, it seems to be a need, a key to bring forward. This is a call for cooperation, cooperatives themselves, but also for the federation and international organization at the world level. And not only inside the cooperative movement, but also to collaborate with other actors that are dealing with the same kind of issues. So to join our forces and respond to the actual situation together. From the crisis, there is maybe a lot of challenges, but also an opportunity, an opportunity to show what we can do, an opportunity for us to be responsible of what is our role as a cooperative movement, but also as as worker cooperatives. Worker cooperatives have always been considered a way to secure work conditions especially during a crisis time. And this is where maybe we don't need to forget this. We need to remind this and being aware of this and keep connecting people, workers, and provide maybe a solution in the future keep providing solution for decent work and decent work conditions in the future. I hope I'm in the time. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to hear your experiences. For us is always a great learning.
Remarkable work, Francesca. Thank you so much. And even highlighting some of the ways that co-ops are thriving and surviving in these times, and even bringing up that the disparities in data and how we dismantle some of these digital barriers. So I appreciate your leadership and your diligence and all those actionable insights that you shared with us. We're going to move on to Hazel Cochran, the Executive Director of CWCF. So Hazel, please, I'd love for you to share with us that big picture. How are co-ops going to show us the way? What strategies are we using to survive and thrive during this pandemic?
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, Francesca. It's wonderful to hear from you and to have you with us. As you say, it's not the first time we have had a Cicopa person in our conference. We did in the past have Bruno Relance when he was still there, but it's the first time to welcome you. So it's wonderful to hear from you. And I would echo many of the themes that you shared. I would just say to begin that in terms of where the worker co-op movement is in Canada, I think the kinds of themes that Francesca spoke to are very much reflected in our country. And certainly there's a wide diversity of how COVID has affected the worker co-ops. Some are doing significantly better from a financial perspective. I think all are stressed or stretched, in different ways because of their obvious focus on the well-being of their members and communities. And so, decisions are made in terms of ensuring that worker owners and workers are safe and protected. And that is continuing. I know we see many co-ops that are exceeding the public health measures recommended by their local governments and so on. Others are really stressed by, if they're in an industry that counts on foot traffic coming in, cafes, retail stores that don't do much online and that kind of thing, they're really stressed financially. And luckily in our country, we've for the most part had pretty decent government supports, especially from the federal government. And I think we've been relatively lucky with the government that we have had, in the sense that it is a minority parliament with I think a fairly strong voice from parties that have pushed the federal Liberal government to actually do quite a bit. And we're appreciative to Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, which did a lot of work to ensure that all of the programming available to businesses were available to co-ops as well. And that has, as far as I'm aware, not been an issue. Like, our membership has been able to access the programs, and including for individuals, of course, but as businesses as well. And I guess I would just say, in terms of the state of the sector, Co-ops and Mutuals Canada, which I'll call CMC, and a couple of universities, St. Mary's and l'Université de Sherbrooke, have done the beginnings. They've done a survey for how COVID has affected the broader co-op sector. A decent number of worker co-ops did respond, and we've seen some of that data, and we really appreciate that. But I think for purposes of this keynote, I want to focus more on the present and the future than what's happened to date. And I think we'll look forward to seeing the results from the CMC St. Mary's Sherbrooke survey in terms of how people have really been impacted and co-ops have really been impacted, which is coming out in coming months and or a bit longer, but we'll hear more about that later. Anyway, I would say that in terms of where we're at in general in the movement, I mean, we see a lot of new worker co-ops coming up. We see a lot of interest in the model, especially among young people and racialized people and women. And I would say that in general for our movement, although we created this great strategic plan a few years ago that was launched in 22 years back, I guess, just pre-pandemic. And that's not true. It was launched 3 years ago. So we had a year that was fully pre-pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And the strategic plan that we created with support from Russ Christensen and all our members very engaged was very much centered on in-person activities, hosting local events, going out and meeting our members, a whole variety of things that became impossible as soon as we hit March 2020. So that was very disappointing. But on the other hand, as Francesca noted, you know, the fact that we're doing things virtually means that it's actually easier for people to come together in different ways. It's not nearly as much fun or as interesting to meet this way as opposed to meeting at the Vancouver YWCA, which we're hoping to do a year from now, or at the Tatamagouche Center, or in Quebec City, or wherever it might be. But it is, practically speaking, I guess, creates different opportunity. And for that reason, I guess we've seen by far the highest registration for a CWCF conference this year. I think the last record was 100 people, and this year we see 160 some odd, with more coming in kind of every minute as of today. So I think we're set to close to double that record. Not everyone at every session, but people can come to where they wish. In general, I think our strategic plan, which is really focused on growing the worker co-op movement to realize more potential and being part of and leading in the solidarity economy, it's coming to pass. Though obviously with continuing challenges, you know, in light of the pandemic, not only, also the climate emergency, which, you know, with the flooding in BC right now, which is astounding, after the fires in the summer, et cetera. And that's just one location. You know, it's everywhere. We know the climate emergency is real. And of course, the growing income and wealth inequality, real. All those things are real crises. The racism crisis, the residential schools crisis, and, you know, all those things, I think, and sort of the pandemic as kind of a crystallizing agent, they're creating this drive among so many people to look for alternatives. And I think that's why we're seeing this, this great shift. And, you know, I think back, I can't say the exact year, whenever the US Federation held its conference in Boston, I think it might've been 2010-ish, 2011, somewhere around 10 years ago, they had been getting, you know, the sort of size of conferences that we typically have, despite their much larger population. And then suddenly that year, there was this kind of great turning in the US worker co-op movement. And I recall Melissa Hoover, executive director of the day, and her main colleague, I think it was Amy Johnson, saying, we can't believe it. Like, suddenly we have 400 people showing up, and, you know, like the interest is coming out of the woodwork. And I feel like, you know, although Canada has consistently had a worker co-op movement kind of theoretically about the same size as the US, 2/3 of which is in Quebec, and not necessarily turning out in the numbers we'd hope to our events, but you know, we see that kind of turning happening here, where like suddenly in the last months, I'm seeing like different spaces of interest where I never heard it before, you know, like an association of nonprofit organizations is suddenly saying, what is this thing called the worker co-op, and how can we learn to incubate it? And I say to them, well, that's what we've been doing, you know, thinking on for so many years. And we know how. The issue is having the resources to do it. Like we think of CWCF at this point relative to what we were, many years back, as, you know, being stable, but we're still very tiny as a national organization, and need significantly greater resources. So, you know, in terms of where the worker co-ops themselves are, we know that some of those federal supports are ending, and some of those federal supports are going to demand, or some of them are loans, and they demand repayment in a year. And we at CWCF are thinking actively about how do we work with them to ensure that they can survive repayment of a substantial loan that they may have just been using to run their operations. And luckily, we do have some resources that we've built up and eked out over the years in terms of our Tenacity Works Fund that we're trying very hard to grow through the Social Finance Fund. Anyway, and so we're more on that later. And the other thing I'd just like to say is I feel like the work we've been doing in the JEDI space, and thanks to Imran Kadardina for coming up with that great word for our Racial Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, the JEDI Committee, reference to Star Wars intended, I'm sure, Imran. It's very exciting space, and there's just like, I feel explosive interest and potential in the space of working in racialized communities. I'm just like so grateful to you, Victor, for your leadership there, and Christine Clark, who cannot be with us because she's too busy farming this week, and Susanna Redekop, who will be joining, and others, Alexis Rodriguez, and so on. Anyways, thanks to all who've been engaged in that work. I also wanted to mention that I feel, we have been a bit stressed by CWCF, our Worker Co-op Federation and movement's relationship to the broader co-op movement. And we've had challenges, and I know our federation is not alone in the world. By talking to Socopa, we've had challenges in relating to the broader co-op movement. And I just want to say it's really refreshing that with the new team of staff and board at CMC, and thanks to Reba for serving there now as well on the board of CMC, that I feel our relationship with the broader co-op movement is dramatically improving, and we're really appreciative and grateful for that. And I think I'm at time, but the future feels optimistic. I feel that our CWCF and our worker co-op movement in Canada are at that same turning point the US Federation was at 10-ish years ago. And now I'm excited to hear from Esteban to tell us where they're at there. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Hazel, for your leadership and your remarkable vulnerability and the context you provided from a Canadian perspective. It's so important, and we really appreciate you. You have no idea. So with that being said, we're going to move on to our colleague, Esteban Kelly, the Executive Director of USFWC, straight out of Philadelphia. We appreciate your attendance and your leadership, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much for that intro. You have to forgive me for going pretty quickly because there's just a lot to cover in updates. There's so much going on. I struggle to even update my board on a regular basis. So I'm not going to say more about who we are. The context should be obvious. It's kind of the equivalent of CWCF, but in the US. Because of how bilingual our membership is, we often prepare a lot of our materials in both English and Spanish. So that's what's reflected here. In terms of changes, I'm going to toggle a little bit and jump into our COVID update on a different set of a different document in a moment. But we do a census every 2 years. We used to do it annually. And it was just too bothersome to our members to poke them all the time. So we've slowed that down. We did just wrap up the last census of worker co-ops, and we estimate there to be somewhere close to 1,000 worker co-ops in the US, although we've only been able to confirm and verify just about 500 of those. So we think that it's double, including the ones that are not incorporated and official, and how hard it can be to capture that data accurately. But and then we also think that is somewhere around 10,000 workers. It's a little confusing because every once in a while, one of these projects will just skyrocket out of nowhere. About 5 months ago, our members in New York City launched a drivers co-op that some of you might have heard about as a platform co-op. And they already have somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 drivers. That's not reflected in this data or these numbers, for example. And they haven't closed out a full year of operations yet. So they're also not reflected in our count of how many co-ops there are. They are reflected in our membership numbers because they did join and we're able to report and pull those numbers right away. We closed out last year with almost 330 members, and we've recruited a lot more. So we think there's something around 350 members in the Worker Co-op Federation in the US now. And this map just sort of shows a little bit of where the concentrations are strongest in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast and out in California. This is not that different from other co-op associations around the worker co-op associations around the world, but we're really highly concentrated in service sector industries, home health care, childcare, domestic labor, some retail, and different kinds of professional services. We do a lot of our organizing through our grassroots membership councils. And I'm using this as a shorthand to sort of indicate the kinds of programs that our members are always working on, but then what that looks like in any given year or political moment or historical moment. So for example, our Union Co-ops Council has been really active this year. A lot of them are appearing on podcasts talking about Striketober and the sort of labor organizing wave that's sweeping our country right now. They also just introduced a set of principles that our membership just voted on this fall to lay out what it looks like to do cooperative development ethically in the context of unionized workplaces. If you're working on conversions or maybe even a consumer co-op that's interested in becoming a worker co-op, and what do you do if that workforce is unionized? And so it lays out a dozen or so principles for co-op developers as a guideline, just for example. Similar with our Immigrant Co-ops Council, we've been doing a lot of training in that space, peer mentorship, technical assistance. We just launched a speakers bureau that bridges actually all of these councils, including our Racial and Economic Justice Council. And our policy work has been pretty active. We're building a lot of coalitions to advance work around climate justice, obviously worker ownership, but not necessarily. Sometimes it's a coalition who cares about worker ownership. Oftentimes we get traction by advancing work that includes worker ownership as a solution to some other kind of problem, which could be one in the food system. It could be one around community wealth building, around workforce development for immigrants and communities of color. And that's where we find that there's actually a lot of traction, is bringing co-op solutions to broader political coalitions. Oh, you know what? I'm actually gonna, instead of introducing my staff, I'm gonna hop over real quick to, yeah, okay. So just a quick update about, wow, well, I'm hearing the French in the English channel. Is that happening for other people?
Yes.
No.
Okay, I think maybe it's fixed now. Great. So we released this report about a year ago. And so I might fill in some things that have shifted that reflect our most recent data. But we did reach out to members. We called through our entire membership when the pandemic hit, and also started gathering data about how our businesses were affected. And just want to share a little bit of those takeaways. This is a report you can download from our website, and but it does paint I think a clearer picture of what was going on. So up here in this top left corner, you'll see what happened with the workforces themselves. A lot of them responded to the pandemic by either reducing hours or furloughing workers, rather than letting them go entirely. A fair number actually kept the same size workforce, and we provided a lot of technical assistance or advice about how to manage to do that. And just as many worker co-ops hired new workers as laid off old workers. I think what has shifted since then is that over the last year, that has started to skew a little more, which is that some people, especially in the healthcare industry, have not returned to work. Many of them were able to access unemployment programs. And so when they left their cooperative jobs doing home healthcare, they just said, this is too risky. I'm staying home. I can get by on unemployment insurance. And so, yeah, there are, especially in domestic and other kinds of retail and service sector industries, there hasn't necessarily been the same bounce back that we've seen in professional services, light manufacturing, transportation, and business services cooperatives. So that's one shift, and it does impact actually our demographic numbers in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity, country of origin, which is that so many of the bigger cooperatives are the sources of employment for a lot of worker owners of color, a lot of immigrant worker owners, and a lot of women. And so that our more recent data shows that that Latinx members are a slightly smaller percentage than they had been prior to the pandemic. That's gone from, they actually were the plurality, and now they're the second largest number, I get, next to white worker owners. which has ticked up. And also that we used to be about close to 70% women and femmes in terms of gender, and that's down to about closer to 60 something percent. So that's just some example of how that's shifted. Lastly, and Francesca made this point, that similar to other parts of the world, worker co-ops in the US did a lot of shifts in their business plan. And so we share some of those anecdotes and examples in this report, where some of the cafes became food hubs. They already had relationships with wholesale food buyers, and they were able to provide for their community when traveling and distance and food miles really got in the way. And other ones either continued some of their new product lines or business services, even once they reverted to whatever their traditional business was, or have found other ways of either incubating new cooperative spin-offs, or have just adapted in other ways. So it's been interesting to collect some of those stories. I'm getting the time warning, so maybe I'll leave it at that, and see if we have time for questions, possibly.
Absolutely, Esteban, we appreciate your leadership. Francesca gave us that international lens, and you gave us a remarkable conceptualization of what's going on in the US, not just from a policy standpoint, but also a racial equity standpoint, which is so important. So I know you have to leave early. So with that being said, we'd like to open up a Q&A specific for you. And the first question, we're going to go to Hazel.
Thank you so much, Esteban, and thank you, Victor, as well. Yeah, so I think that part of the challenge for our federations is figuring out how to make the absolute best strategic kinds of choices within our limited resources to try to have the maximum impact, obviously. And I think some of the coordination we've been doing between US Federation, CWCF, along with the Mexican one and so on, is we've not done it right. I'm being self-critical here of all of us collectively, but we've got this thing called CICOPA North America, and it's not working well enough, right? So we have to figure out how to leverage the partnerships we can have. And I think about the Union Co-op Council and of the US, and I stuck it in the chat, and I know there are Canadians a bit involved in that, possibly including Johnny, who's going to speak later. And I have been on it and so on. And I feel like when we each have a great initiative going, we need to figure out how to invite people from our neighbor countries. Like maybe we want to invite you and engage some of your folks in our JEDI committee, and or I'm not sure what all, but we would maybe want to fully join into your union co-op group. Like, how do we just like not reinvent the wheel every time? Is there openness to that? I know you guys are doing that. You folks are doing that with the region federations approach. Can we do something nationally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that a lot of it comes down to organizing principles, which is to say, I think where we're limited is not in a lack of applying effective tactics, but actually slowing down to figure out our strategy and distinguishing between tactics and strategy, or even backing up to goals. Like, what is it we're trying to accomplish? And so I don't know that I have the same sort of critical takeaway about CICOPA North Americas or even CICOPA Americas. I think that the CICOPA formations, we're still figuring out what is it we're even trying to accomplish together. So to say, this is failing or it's not doing what it's meant to do, I'm like, have we really clarified what it's meant to do? I don't know. I think at the bare minimum, we're meant to at least have a platform for building and strengthening relationships, and that's starting, and that's helpful. In other words, if my Union Co-ops Council then has an idea or questions, I can move through CICOPA or through our bilateral relationships, like with Le Réseau or with CWCF or even CMC, and bring those kinds of questions or opportunity. I know a person that I can connect to start with, but I do think that there still is a lot of question of what is it that we're trying to do, and is it singularly about cooperative development, or is it about strengthening curriculum, education, and training, or figuring out other ways of addressing the social problems around us, whether that's climate change or the issue that's going on right now in, well, at least in the US economy, the great net resignation and Striketober. And I mean, there's a lot of labor questions going on. So yeah, I think that there is still a lot that we can learn from each other. And I think it begins by clarifying what are the goals and purposes of what we're trying to do so that we can then figure out the strategy. And then the tactics are just ready. I mean, there's like a million things that everybody is doing that we can borrow and iterate from and customize to our own local organizing contexts. And it's actually, that brings me to something that I forgot to mention, to just echo what you were saying earlier, Hazel, about public interest and participation and sort of the profile of cooperatives, and ways that our national and public programming can be an indicator of that interest. Last year, and mind you, this was only about 6 months after COVID-19 hit in the US, but we did attract 1,000 people to more than that, 1,200 people to our national conference, which was just mind-blowing, especially considering it was on Zoom and people were already Zoom fatigued. Now this year we had a lower profile conference, but we still had 500 people register for it, delivering content in at least 2 languages, which was pretty cool. And a lot of it was very nuts and bolts. It wasn't, you know, here's how cool worker co-ops are. It's let's figure out, let's learn about the tradition of, for example, Black co-op development in Black communities, and then let's support Black leaders in problem solving, what it looks like to address this in our communities. Now, those might be the moments to then say what's worked in other parts of the Black diaspora approaching co-op development, or specifically worker co-op development. So that's where I think having that infrastructure in the background is going to be helpful, just to connect the various threads a little bit.
Remarkable. Thank you so much for your leadership. There was a few statements in the chat, but not specific questions. If there is anyone that wants to ask a specific question, please unmute. It's going to be challenging for me to see all the hands based off the multiple screens I'm on. But if you can just unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Esteban, that'll be great.
Esteban, if nobody else has a question, I'll just say I put my responses to what you were saying in the chat because I was worried about taking airtime we didn't have. But part of the challenge on our side is we don't have enough engagement in the North America space from the Canadian side, from the Quebecers, Le Réseau, from our direct membership, from our board or what have you. And I know you folks have an international committee. And so when I go to Sacopa North America events online, always, we've got multiple people from the US, sometimes multiple people from Mexico, or at least there's always presence. And I feel like we don't have enough engagement to properly have that discussion. So I'm putting out a call, and I know it's being said in French at the same time, that if we could get another few volunteers, maybe form a loose international committee from our side, I think there would be interest in that, but
yeah,
just haven't been able to identify them yet. And we actually have more involvement on Cicopa Americas, which all happens in Spanish, because I'm happy to say Marcelo Vieta and Martin Vandenbois, who are very fluent in Spanish, well, one's a native speaker, you know, they are participating too. And my Spanish is just bad enough, like it's good enough to get me into trouble, and I can't really properly participate in Spanish, right? So, but again,
that's like me with my French.
Okay, oui, c'est vrai, je pense.
Although I don't get into trouble in French, only Italian I get in trouble. That's maybe that's more cultural, if anything. No, I think so. Actually, that's one of the other updates is that our board just last month voted to create a new member council. I showed a slide with our four existing member councils. And the fourth one, this was an idea that I had a few years ago at a board retreat, was to turn our board's international committee, because it was set up as a subcommittee of the board, into a member council. And so we're going to be doing work this winter to build that out as a formal member council. We have a charter that I drafted up with the support of some of our board members, and it just ended up being the right timing for that, because the board members who had been serving on that committee, their term was running up anyway. And so by broadening it and turning it into a member council, they can continue to serve there, and we can now open it up and figure out what's our strategy, and not just saying, how do we plug members in, but what are we inviting them into? And is the purpose primarily representation? Is it stuff around solidarity and organizing? Is it around co-op development and figuring things out? So those are the kinds of questions that we think about a lot. I'm actually going to be going to Asia for the first time. I'm going to the ICA Congress in Seoul in like a week and a half, 2 weeks. And so it is useful to have those kinds of committees in place, that organizing existing, and I don't want to make it seem like it's magic. I mean, it really was a slow and very intentional process of building out that international work. And I mean, it was basically non-existent for us 5-6 years ago. I was in a very similar situation of serving on multiple international spaces, and it really did start with just a small dedicated people stepping up to participate. And I'm excited about what that's going to lead to now that we're building this out into a member council.
Thank you so much for your leadership, Esteban. We have one question from Evan, and then we're going to have to move on to our colleague Kelly Story. Esteban,
Sure.
We appreciate your leadership. Go ahead, Evan.
Thanks, Victor. Esteban, I just wanted to touch on what you were talking about earlier with the kind of proliferation of co-ops that you're seeing down in the States. And I know that's something that Hazel has been mentioning recently too, that there seems to be a lot of growth in the movement down there. I'm just wondering if you have any insight as to where that's coming from. Is that from the work that your federation is doing, or is that a grassroots movement? Or if you could speak a little bit to that, that'd be great.
Well, it's all of the above. It's a great question. Thanks, Evan. We've been very intentional about building an ecosystem and building that approach, which is to say, you're not going to like strike a partnership with the one great institution or nonprofit or have some incredible federal policy roll out and then suddenly overnight you have a bunch of co-ops. I mean, co-op development takes ages. The skills involved, the difference between something that's incubated versus something that's more entrepreneurial. I mean, all of those kinds of nuances really do matter. And so for us, we have tried to see what is the limiting factor at any one moment in time for any of those pathways to worker ownership. And let's remove those barriers. That might be suggesting policy changes. That might be building out curriculum. We just rolled something out last winter with the mayor's office in the city of New York, a program called Owner to Owners, which is just a public communications partnership with the city around taking existing small immigrant or minority-owned businesses. And there's a hotline, there's billboard advertisements to just say, like, here's who you can talk to get the technical support you need in order to do that. So in order to have something like that happen, we need to have built out the reputation that like co-ops are not a joke, like that we're serious and you can work with us even if you're the government of the city of New York. We have to have the technical assistance and the capacity. We had to have the language capacity existing. We had to have a resource, a website that tells stories of worker co-ops that were converted in a host of, dozens of different industries so that people could say, yes, but will this work for my bodega? Will it work for my light manufacturing thing? Will it work for my catering company? So there's a lot of different pieces there. I mean, building up our policy work and having those reputations with the kind of political coalitions that do advocacy work. And that's not easy to just do generally nationally in the background. I mean, it really meant we had to build that out locally over time. And it also meant we couldn't just show up and say, we think co-ops are great, please jump on board. We had to show up for other people and their political priorities and campaigns and lend our support to things that they were leading. And in order for it to ultimately come back around for their support to what we're doing.
Thank you so much for your leadership, Esteban. We appreciate you. Unfortunately, Esteban does have to leave, folks, and we gave a small amount of time for Q&A for him specifically. Esteban, we appreciate your leadership, your diligence, and all the context you provided. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And sorry for disrupting the agenda. It's just a really hectic week. Everybody, it's good to see you. Please stay in touch. Nice to see all the old friends who I've gotten to see in person pre-pandemic times. Appreciate it.
And hopefully Eric can put his question in the chat, and maybe myself or Hazel can get that question to you And because Eric, I saw your hand up, we appreciate you as well. Warm regards, Esteban. So folks, obviously we were edified with a remarkable context around the US experience and around some actionable ways that folks are mobilizing and organizing. But we're gonna move on to our next colleague, Kelly Story, the Executive Director of La Siembra Co-op in Ottawa. Kelly, please, we appreciate you.
Great, thanks, Victor. And thanks for that update from the different co-op sectors, both in the US and abroad and in Canada, because it's really interesting to hear what's happening from a movement perspective, and how that co-op development and the work on transitioning new businesses into the worker co-op model is happening in practice. I'm going to kind of pick up on some of the themes that Francesca and Hazel and Esteban have already mentioned, talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on our worker co-op operations and model, and how we've been able to kind of leverage those values to overcome and thrive during the pandemic that might be relatable for some, but also the opportunities that we're seeing kind of in the workforce and in the sector to strengthen the movement outside of the work of the associations. Because there's so many people here, new and old faces, I'll just give you a little bit of a background about who we are. So we're La Siembra Co-operative. We're obviously worker owners that import, manufacture, and sell fair trade chocolate and sugar products in the Canadian market under the Camino brand. And then we had, during the pandemic, we had close to about 1,000 metric tons of fair trade food arriving in our Ottawa-based warehouse. And so COVID-19 had an immediate impact on both the movement of people and food and commodities across borders. And anyone dealing with international supply chains or in international supply chains, I'm sure, can relate to that, impacting both workers, but also the small farmer co-ops that we're working with globally. And then, like most businesses at the beginning of the pandemic, we were very worried about continuity, serving customers, meeting contracts, moving food from the south, paying bills, keeping workers safe and employed. And our thinking at the time is, who's going to buy premium chocolate, when you're worried about the health and stability of your job? People are sheltering in place. We saw, hoarding and food shortages in grocery stores. And so it was hard to think about how sugar and chocolate products were going to fare in that situation. And then also which retailers or sales channels are going to remain open for us outside of the corporate grocery stores to ensure that we can keep moving volume for producers into the market. So this sudden kind of business reality forced us to have difficult conversations with the members and the owners of the business about what is core work? How do you define essential business and essential work? And then also addressing kind of the disparity and fairness of those workers that have to be physically on site, picking, packing orders, fully masked all day long, very difficult physical labor versus the work that could be done from the safety of our homes. And so we always thought of ourselves as an administrative business or a marketing business. And then suddenly both the physical and non-physical aspects of the work had to be kind of evaluated in the new context. And of course, we're depending on the physical labor and the presence of our team to show up and fill orders and potentially expose themselves to COVID so that we can continue to operate the business, which really kind of led to having open conversations around pay equity, how we value and compensate certain jobs in the co-op, and then as business owners, who should step in, backstop, pivot to cover off jobs should anyone at the co-op get sick during that time. And those are really difficult conversations to have inside worker co-ops, particularly if you're focused on valuing meaningful, dignified work, worker autonomy, and the fair distribution of that work. So it was a really interesting moment for us to see how we were going to respond. And of course, all our concerns about declining revenues and low profits was very quickly abated because, as it turns out, a whole lot of consumers bought chocolate and comfort food and turned to home baking during the pandemic, which has then since led to record-breaking sales for La Siembra. So that's been very exciting. But the process of figuring out who is physically on site and who is an essential worker and who do we need for business continuity versus the work that was being done at home had a massive impact on the way that we thought about how we run the business. And then also like how we value and compensate certain work and the control and the ownership piece, of course, having to adapt to that strong demand for fair trade food and not just survive, but actually thrive over the last 12 months. So it's been very interesting. We've had to hire, I think we've hired 4 new, I don't think it netted out to 4, but I think we've had to go through hiring for 4 new positions at the co-op. And then we've been able to kind of promote existing staff into leadership positions, budget for salary increases, and stay relatively connected culturally and healthy as a team. And I really attribute that to the social capital that we built early on by way of leveraging our worker co-op model and that democratic, open, transparent way of working together to make space for worker owners to think about the way we contribute to the work. So, so that piece of surviving and thriving has certainly shifted our culture once again. So we're constantly trying to evolve the thinking around the model itself. And then as a sector, I think we're in the perfect position to respond to a changing worker-driven economy that puts people at the center of the economic activity. One's probably considered a more radical way to organize ourselves and govern, is now an attractive way for people to think about the way that they want to work, make a living and commit themselves to the workforce. And so during the hiring process, this has become very apparent to us. And if anyone has tried to hire in the last 12 months, you know that employees are certainly in control. And the business community, traditional business community, or the whole business community is now struggling to attract and retain talent, which I think comes up in a later session today. But of course, here at La Siembra, as we try to grow out the team, the candidates that we've interviewed over the last few weeks and last few months are certainly looking for alternative modes of work and remuneration. And then on the business development side, a really interesting development that's come up to us during COVID is that we see a real rise in new organic food and home-based businesses that have been incubated in response to kind of in response to a shift in home-based business models, in-home baking and kitchens, and also thinking during COVID around our health, our wellness, and sustainable food production. And then workers, what we've seen is workers in transition, or kind of those workers that found themselves unemployed during the pandemic, became very entrepreneurial. And many of them, you know, as Hazel mentioned, accessing government programs, specifically ones that have been geared towards stabilizing local food economies and food innovation to create new businesses for themselves. And many of the new businesses or transitioning businesses are reaching out to us for advice on how to start and incorporate worker-owned enterprise in order to either grow their ideas or share risk or scale and be sustainable. And I would say there was a period where every couple of months, and perhaps this is because we've done a good job at promoting our worker co-op brand. Maybe it's the new branding on the packaging where our consumers didn't always know that we were a worker co-op, or we've done a good job at embedding the democratic model within the value chain. There was just months where people were calling us or reaching out saying, I'm a new business. I'd like to think about the worker co-op structure. Could you meet with us and talk about your experiences in the business and what we should know? And so, I mean, I think as a sector, we have this great opportunity now to promote worker ownership, create new co-ops or convert others, and start that peer-to-peer process of learning. And
Kelly,
depending, yes.
Kelly, I apologize, but
That's okay.
Victor has messaged me to say he's lost some sort of part of his connection, although I think he might still be on a different device, and I think you're supposed to wrap up now.
I am. Yes, I'm on my last my last point.
Okay. Thanks.
And then I think that there's such a breadth of experience here in Canada that we could certainly learn and leverage to incubate and strengthen new co-ops that are coming online. And I think there's going to be more and more of them as the democratic model of economic activity starts to take place.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And unless and until I hear from Victor that he's back, I'm going to take over facilitating as he had requested. So really interesting to hear and really heartening to hear how things are going at La Siembra. Here comes Victor back. Certainly, I think a lot of that will resonate for many of the folks on the call and in the movement. And then others will be wishing that some of those issues were resonating for them about how to find talent, because instead they've had to go the other way. But it's all encouraging to hear what you folks are up to and overcoming the international supply chain things, etc. And although I did just let another iteration of Victor Beausoleil into the room, I'm not hearing him. So I'm just going to now introduce Johnny, whose last name I believe is pronounced Sapachuk.
Pretty close.
Okay, you can say it for us, but he's with the Value Co-op in Vancouver, the Vancouver Artist Labor Union Co-op. I did just want to say, we went to a lot of effort to get everyone's bios and photos into this great document. And I'm not sure if that's been mentioned yet this time, but I will get it into the chat momentarily so that you can get them properly introduced. We don't want to take the time to go through everyone's bios verbally, but Johnny, with that, I'll ask you to speak to us now. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Hazel. And nice to see everyone this morning, or I guess morning for me, here in what is now a sunny Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm calling in from Burnaby, and want to recognize I'm on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Hunkaminam and Squamish speaking peoples, and recommit to reconciliation and redistribution to Indigenous peoples. My name's, as Hazel said, Johnny Sapachuk. It's a weird Ukrainian pronunciation that has seemed to change over time as my ancestors came over to from the Ukraine as settlers into Canada. We've gone through several iterations, and everyone in my family pronounces it a bit differently. I'm a proud worker owner of two actual co-ops, worker co-ops, the Vancouver Artist Labor Union Co-operative, and a new Stitchers co-op here in Vancouver. We formed about 3 years ago, and our launch was actually just at the outset of the pandemic. So we publicly launched about a month before the pandemic hit. We are a group of, at the time, we were 17 visual and media-based artists who came together to deal with precarity in the arts and to create a common space for employment. So our cooperative specifically focused on providing services for partner organizations. We do buttons and masks and tote bags and other type of creative services that were really designed for person-to-person interaction. So you think campaigns, conventions, and meetings. And when the pandemic hit, our entire business dried up. So it was a really rough time for a group of visual artists to be starting a brand new cooperative that was based on person-to-person interaction. So we lost about $100,000 in potential contracts overnight when the pandemic hit, and we had just been operating for a couple months pretty informally. So it was a tough time for our co-op. We had to contract. We had some members who left the co-op, but we have been lucky to now be in a place of growth. As a cooperative, as a worker co-op, we are also a unionized worker co-op. So our members are the founding members of the Arts and Cultural Workers Union. I serve as president of the union, and we are aligned with IATSE, which is a union representing film and theater workers. So what it means to be a unionized cooperative is that we have a collective agreement essentially with ourselves, and that sets our terms and conditions of pay, working hours, and provides us with a vital link to the broader labor and union movement. Our co-op is based on a series of 14 values around community redistribution, politics around racial justice, and a key part is about changing working conditions in the arts and cultural sectors. We want it to be outwards looking while also focusing on our members' needs. So we've gone through some spurts of growth. The pandemic was tough. Like I said, we lost almost $100,000 in business, but that allowed us to repivot and start to change the way we were doing business. So we shifted away from the person-to-person interaction and started looking at ways we could develop materials and services for partner organizations that met the needs during the pandemic. So one of our first big pivots was around mask making. So we were lucky that we were able to partner with another labor union, IATSE Local 118, and we were able to recruit about 20 sewers, costume shop professionals from the theater industry who had all been laid off because theater had been almost virtually erased during the pandemic. And so those theater costume shop professionals came together, started producing masks from their homes, and Value Co-op started marketing and reselling those, allowing organizations to custom brand it. And that was a big source of our income over 2020. We also were able to start doing on kits of materials that were supporter appreciation, member appreciation. Our biggest kit actually featured the fantastic chocolate from La Siembra through our partner here in BC called Co-Dev. And that was sent to, I think, about 500 delegates to the Canadian Labour Congress convention across Canada. So today, really, we've actually grown as a co-op. So in this last year, we've done about $200,000 in sales. And the majority of that, about 160K of that goes directly into wages for our members. That our co-op has grown. We're up to about 32 full members and worker collaborators. And one of the core tenets of our co-op is on racial justice. So when we were first forming as a co-op, there were 8 of us in a room, and we looked around, and 6 of us identified as white, as settlers. And we knew that from the setting the floor of our co-op and the foundation of our co-op, we needed to be founded on issues of racial justice, and that meant our membership needed to be reflective of the communities we were trying to organize. So we expanded. We brought in another group of worker owners, almost entirely IBPOC members, Indigenous, Black, and people of color. And I'm really proud that our co-op, over 50% of the membership is IBPOC, and in every leadership position, it's well over 50% of our membership is IBPOC. And those racial justice issues were embedded in the day-to-day operations, but also in our political goals of the co-op. So the type of community partnerships we've taken on. We've done some really great mutual aid programs with groups like Indigenous Women Outdoors and the Nesting Doula Collective, which is a BIPOC birthing collective based out of Vancouver Island. And to the broader points around solidarity in the cooperative movement, we know as a co-op, we would not have been successful without solidarity from community cooperatives and the broader labor movement. That's where our orders, our business came from. And so our survival strategies during the start of the co-op, during the start of the pandemic, were one, many of us maxed out our credit cards and had lines of credit. We took out some lines of credit through the Canadian government. And to speak to Hazel's points, if it wouldn't have been from federal programs that were expanded to the cooperative sector, we would not have survived. We received emergency wage relief and emergency funding. But more importantly, we received solidarity orders and orders from other cooperatives like Shift Delivery, Terminal City here in Vancouver, Glass Cooperative, labor unions, community organizations, and artists. And so the pandemic, I think, has been, tough on the business of the co-op, but it's also been really tough on having us working together. At the start, we were built on creating community, and so we stopped having meetings in person. We pivoted to value co-op social hours online, and it's great to see faces, but you still can't get that same type of building those deep relationships, and we're hoping to return to that. But it allowed us to really focus on our production processes and our business models. And so our biggest challenge right now as a co-op is actually our growth and our cash flow issues. So we're doing too many sales that we're having trouble meeting payroll while also ordering fair trade materials, and some of the similar issues that Kelly mentioned around supply chains. That's also a struggle for our co-op, but it has allowed us to innovate. So at the start, I mentioned the mask making project. Instead of ordering tote bags based out of a producer in Toronto, and I'm just wrapping up here, Hazel. Instead of, I notoriously speak too long, so I always time myself. It allowed us to focus here on production. And so we have a brand new cooperative here in Vancouver producing masks and tote bags, and soon to be more. And bringing in new members was really the injection of new energy that we needed as a co-op to survive. So really thankful for all of you listening and for the invitation, Hazel, and I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, and it's great to hear the really innovative work you folks are doing. And I'm really pleased to hear that you're in a much better financial state than the last I knew quite a long while ago. Apologies. Victor, I gather you're still not back fully. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. So I was just going to say that we did have a question that came from Eric directly to me, and I wanted to suggest, Eric, if you're here, that you would ask the question now in the group, and then we'll go beyond that too. And people can raise your hands either with the reactions space or with your physical hand.
Thanks, Hazel. Good to see everybody. My question originally was to CWCF and Estevan in the United States, but I think it could apply to all the other members of the panel. In this period when we're seeing a growth in worker cooperatives and the strength of some of the co-ops and the work that the last Johnny and Kelly just shared, are you also seeing a corresponding respect or recognition from the traditional business community, or from government, or in the way MBA courses are taught? Are we getting more respect as we get as we show our resilience in this? And I can direct that to anybody, whoever wants to go with it.
I could start, and then I'll ask Kelly and Johnny to add, and Francesca. I would say quickly, with the federal government, one thing that has shifted is that this group called Social Capital Partners, which has been advocating very strongly for the employee ownership trust approach, including getting them recognized and also getting positive tax and other incentives. They've gotten a lot of great traction with this government, and we are we've written along with CMC a briefing note to the feds where we're basically saying any treatment that goes for this other form of employee ownership should apply to worker co-ops. And I feel like that is getting a great hearing. We're just basically trying to ride their coattails, and that's the easiest kind of lobby in my experience. And so we're pretty optimistic that this general discussion of employee ownership, which I think COVID has helped to open up, we'll be able to get some benefit out of that. Beyond that, it's hard to know. Like, it's a sort of new government, and I think we're somewhat a little more optimistic than we were in the sort of lagging times of the last government. In the other spaces with general business, with universities and so on, MBA programs, I don't see a lot of change happening quickly. In Winnipeg, there's some innovative stuff happening. Simon Berge with his programming there. And as usual, things are continuing at St. Mary's, which is growing, I think. It seems to be. There's their international co-op program. But, you know, it's still small and marginal in the university spaces, mostly. Francesca, do you want to go next and answer that maybe with a more global view and then go to the others?
I would like to give the floor to the others.
Okay, thanks. Kelly?
I feel like we're in a little bit of a bubble, so it's actually really difficult for me to answer that. And because I feel like we keep putting a lot of energy into getting that recognition and that visibility for the sector. And also kind of more to what you were saying, Hazel, I feel like we're also now getting lumped into the interest around social enterprise. And so I'm finding that there's a lot of opportunities, grants, money coming for social enterprise, social impact work. And so we have to then further define ourselves or find what that value proposition is within that context and try to figure out how to check those types of boxes, even though, of course, we're worker co-ops. And so we feel like, of course, we're social enterprise. We're here to, create jobs and build community and do all these great things that that are defined in our mission statements. But I don't know. I don't want to be cynical, but I want to kind of say that it feels status quo, even if there is a lot of opportunity out there to grow and strengthen the sector.
My work has primarily been focusing on a provincial level here in British Columbia, and we have the added challenge of often in co-ops are seen in the arts as like painting clubs. Not that there's anything wrong with painting clubs, but we have to do a lot of self-advocacy around even funding in the arts. We're certainly seeing a shift in British Columbia with an NDP-led government and some key members of government who are from the cooperative sector. So we're actually a part of a lobbying group broader than just the worker co-op movement. And we're hoping that we will have an announcement early spring around new funding initiatives and movement. I don't think the pandemic has spawned that. I really think it's about friendly governments, and the real challenge now is dealing with the long BC Liberal bureaucracy here that is more designed to support big business than even small business and cooperatives. So I'm hopeful.
That's great to hear. I wanted to add too, what I forgot to mention is there is, of course, this program at the federal level called the Social Innovation and Social Finance Initiative, or as we like to call it, the Sisyphus Initiative, because it's never actually, well, okay, the grant part of it, the Investment Readiness Program, has kind of finally rolled out, and I think they're about to launch their third iteration of that. So that's providing grants of up to $50,000, and I know a fair number of worker co-ops have been able to access that. There's also the capital piece, which CWCF has been looking at very carefully because we really want to use it to grow our Tenacity Works Fund. It's the Social Finance Fund, and they announced it 2018, I think it was, and there's still no money out there. I mean, it's supposedly coming soon, so it's been extremely frustrating to watch and to be engaged or try to be engaged with. So hopefully that is shifting soon. And in fact, we have a meeting with the minister that's responsible for it tomorrow. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to hop off the Q&A period of one of our calls because there's the people-centered economy group that we're part of that's led by SEDNet, the Canadian CED network, it secured a meeting with the Minister Karina Gould tomorrow for half an hour. So that's very exciting. And Dan Burnett, who I see here, is going to be on there with me, and maybe others that are here. So that's going on. And Erin has stated something in the chat that I wanted to mention to folks about what's happening at the St. Mary's program, which is growing. And she suggests anyone to reach out to her if you have interest in the St. Mary's master's or certificate or shorter term programming. I want to go to Evan Provin, who's had his hand up for a while there, and then see where we are for time. So Evan, go ahead again.
Yeah, and I'm building on what Aaron is talking about in terms of research on co-ops in the academic world. So I'm currently doing the Master of Management at St. Mary's, and currently taking a course called the Enterprise Model, which is a new course which focuses on a model of enterprise, like the cooperative enterprise model that's being built out by Karen Miner and Sonia Novkovic. But in the early readings that we're doing on the course, it's suggesting that cooperative business models are largely left out of research on conventional businesses, and so they're trying to build on both the statistical analysis of cooperatives and categorization of cooperatives, so that we can have kind of a global definition to build research off of, because without these kind of categories and ways of defining a co-op, it's hard to build research that can be cited and used in educational programs. And one of the components of this course was a video by a woman in Finland that's teaching economics, and she says that her students are outraged when they find out about co-ops and how they work, that they said that it's like something secret has been hidden from them, and that, you know, if they had known about the co-op model beforehand, everything about it makes sense in terms of solving the issues with our current economic issues, environmental issues, and things like that. So I think that in the academic world, putting together these models of cooperatives and classifying them and building statistics on them is going to help to allow more educational programs to be built around the co-op model, so that it can get into the mainstream, so people can figure out what is actually happening.
Thanks, Evan. That's really useful to hear and interesting. And it reminds me of something that happened a number of years ago at an event of Le Conseil québécois de la coopération et de la mutualité, the Quebec Provincial Association, CQCM. There was a significant group of youth that were there, and as there often are at that organization. And one of them stood up and said, you know, like, we were just wondering, like, why is the co-op sector like hiding itself, you know, because we found it so hard to find it. And eventually, you know, the group that's in this youth space, we did find it, but it seemed like dumb luck or, you know, what have you. And it's true, like, we just don't do a very good job of it. And every time I find a co-op that doesn't keep co-op in its name or what have you, and I know there are some in there good business reasons to do it sometimes, etc. I don't mean to like shame anybody or what have you, but it's just, why are we not putting our message out there better? And the social enterprise folks, apologies to the people who are from the social enterprise movement, they are occupying that space in a really innovative way. And the co-ops are not figuring out, how do we point out, okay, so we are not only the first kind of social enterprise, but we're the only democratic, well, we are a very democratic form of social enterprise, and therefore we should be at the center of things. And I feel like what goes on in Europe, and I could be wrong, but from a distance, it looks like what goes on in Europe with Secopa Europe, SECUP, the worker co-op movement and the co-op movement generally are kind of the center of the social and solidarity economy. And in Canada, that is not the case. And when they talk about social innovation and social finance fund, the government is not thinking about us. We have to make sure we like raise our hand really high and jump up and down and point out we're part of this too. And sometimes the social enterprise definitions exclude co-ops, like the Social Enterprise World Forum. They held a giant event in Calgary a few years ago. They did it again recently. I can't tell if it was in Halifax or virtual, but maybe both. Their definitions generally leave out co-ops because they have to be kind of like either nonprofit or necessarily only plowing the profit back into the mandate, which outside Quebec, that definition doesn't always work. And so we have got to figure out how the co-op movement can get into that space. And I feel like I'm getting onto a soapbox here, but anyway.
If I can say that it's a long fight. I think it's even in Europe, it's something that, as you mentioned, CECOP, the regional organization for in Europe of CICOPA, is a fight that the CECOPA has fought for many years now, and is still doing that to make sure that cooperatives are heard also in the social economy movement. So it's a lot of work of, again, connection, be present, make a case. But if you need from CECOP any inspiration, I'm happy to share what the results have been achieved so far. So.
Thank you, Francesca. That's great to hear. I mean, CECOP has the advantage, of course, that part of its confederation is the Mondragon movement, the Northern Italian movement, which you are from this region of, and the movement in France, the very large, the huge known historic parts of the worker co-op movement are all part of CECOP. And I feel like that can give a credibility that is challenging for those of us in North America. I mean, if anyone ever has seen the chart of the population of the worker co-op movement globally, I mean, North America, even with Quebec and even with what's the growth that's happening in other places, it's a tiny percentage of what goes on in Europe or even Latin America or Asia. So this makes it more challenging for us even than it is for some other parts of the world. I know it was interesting that when we've had the speaker from Argentina, Jose Arbaiceta, at one point, it was clear that our movement in Canada, we are just sort of like a baby brother to what goes on in Argentina, as just one example, right? So we're trying to figure out how do we become part of the social and solidarity economy and be seen as a central piece while being still so small yet so connected and so aware of what the potential is. Thank you, Kelly, for sharing something on the IRP grant. I hope I'm not missing hands. We've only got 3 minutes left in our section here, but if there's anyone got a hand raised, maybe start speaking now. There's lots of screens to look at. Victor, are you back? I'm not hearing Victor. Sandra, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Well, it was actually Evan put a question in earlier specifically to Johnny, and it really, I was like, ooh, yes, I want to know that about how, like, being a unionized co-op, and how do you, like you said, wondering how you bargain between the workers and the co-op versus the union. It's just such an interesting thing that I'm very curious about. And if you had a moment to share about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, good question. And thanks for flagging that, Sandra. I didn't see it in the chat.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, so we bargained a collective agreement with ourselves. So it actually was carving out time away from talking about the business of the co-op to talk about how we individually as workers operated within the co-op. It set minimum terms for wages, probationary periods, meal breaks, all of those type of codified parts of the operations of work. In the long term, the co-op, the union connection has been really helpful for the co-op in twofold. One, it allows us to bug all of our materials, with a union bug, to say, these are made by unionized workers. So it allows us to market our materials to unions, which is the biggest source of our revenue. But more importantly, the union provides that external voice for helping to deal with conflict within the co-op. I would imagine all of our co-ops have experienced conflict. So the union will appoint stewards to support individual members when they're dealing with conflicting issues. We recently had went through a process that was pending dismissal of one of our members to some real extreme conflict. So the member who was who was accused of the discrimination, was appointed an external union steward who helped support them. And that member, or former member, I know was going through some personal issues at the time. Doesn't excuse the behavior, but they're human as well. And then the members who were subject of the issues also had external union stewards. So it really helped having those external partners, supporters, deal with the internal conflict. And those are the practical pieces, putting away the justice kind of, we wanted to be a part of the broader labor movement and not seen as business owners, but actual workers.
Thank you, Johnny. And thank you, Sandra, for spotting that. I didn't notice it in the chat either. Anyway, I did want to just say about the union space quickly that we've certainly attempted to partner and have partnered with labor unions in the past, inspired by the Union Co-op Council. For a while there, we were running something called the Western Labor Worker Co-op Council until we basically ran out of volunteer energy for it or energy for it. But I am really pleased to see that the past executive director of the Canadian Labour Congress, Michael McIsaac, has joined us on the call. And they were a longtime associate member of CWCF and active. And we've had great relationships with the steel workers, SEIU, some others. And great that there are more unionized worker co-ops coming up as well. Anyway, we hope to reignite those relationships in future. I do want to quickly wrap this now because we're just slightly past time, and hopefully we're going to see you all back in 1 hour. I do want to thank so deeply all the panelists for all you've shared, and Esteban vicariously or at a distance here, and also Victor for doing most of the facilitating. And sorry that a couple of people had some tech challenges, including Victor and including potentially one of our speakers who luckily dodge that bullet. But anyways, it's been a great session. I appreciate all of you and all your questions, and hopefully we'll see you back in 1 hour with the session on peer learning, and we'll explain the details there once you get there. But it's going to be on benefits worker co-ops can provide, attracting talent to the sector, and member engagement, as well as a couple of Ignite presentations on some of the co-ops that are in our Worker Co-op Academy, which, as you may know, was inspired by the Réseau's Parcours Co-op program, and we appreciate that. So we'll see you back in an hour. If you're a presenter or a speaker, we'll see you back sooner for sound check. So great. Thanks so much, everyone. See you soon.